just for his information and for those who have joined today. That's why I was trying to tell them some of our activities in Sanskrit Academy. And we have been publishing a lot of books. And I would request Sri Ganesh Swaminathan and also his family members and friends to come to Sanskrit College and also visit us. And you can see what work we are doing. And it is going on in a voluntary way. All of the scholars, we are working in this direction. So it would be, we would be happy to welcome you anytime except on Sundays, 10 to 5. You can come and visit us. And of course, I am sure you would love your stay in our college, in our research institute, in the Sanskrit Academy. And also, I'm sure you would also be benefited by visiting this place, which is a landmark in Mylapore and also in Chennai. And the Madras Sanskrit College was started in 1906 and our Sanskrit Academy in 1927, along with the Music Academy, and also our Kuppuswamy Shastri Research Institute was started in 1945, all in the same campus. We do have some schools in the same campus. So I think all of you would love to visit this place and see the activities, what we are doing, and we would welcome all of you with open heart.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Welcome, sir.
Yeah.
And if Ganesh sir is ready, I think Madam Sita, our secretary, Dr. Sita Sundararaman, can introduce the speaker of the day, and then we will hand over the podium to the speaker of the day, Sri Ganesh Swaminathan. Over to Dr. Sita Sundararaman, please.
Namaste to all. Very happy to introduce Dr. Ganesh Swaminathan. He is graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering from IIT Delhi. He later completed his MBA program from IIM Ahmedabad and has spent most of his professional life in multinational organizations in the field of technology. He has lived and worked in many cities in India, Africa and Europe and Singapore, and has traveled widely. Mr. Ganesh has had an interest in space sciences since school. About 9 years ago, he developed an interest in the Puranas and other ancient Indian texts. He has since read many of the Mahapuranas and has researched texts such as the Surya Siddhanta, Mahabharata, and the Ramayana from the perspective of physical sciences. He was fascinated by the ancient text insights, particularly the parallels to space science. About a year ago, he published a book titled From the Beginning of Time, which explores the cosmology of the Puranas in the context of modern science. The book has been received well, and Amazon currently lists the title in 12 countries around the world, including India, the US, the UK, and Germany. Welcome to Mr. Ganesh Swaminathan.
Thank you very much, madam. Good evening, everybody, and welcome again to this session. And thank you very much for making time on a weekend evening. I really appreciate it. And I also want to thank the Sanskrit Academy for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on the Mahabharata. Now, the Sanskrit Academy has the goddess Saraswati on its logo, and it's very apt that today is Basant Panchami, which is very significant for the goddess Saraswati. And we started the prayer to goddess, asking for her blessings so that the presentation goes well. Yeah. So the Mahabharata is an epic and is considered the longest poem ever written. And this is a text that is loved both by the scholar and the general reader. Numerous books have been written on it, translations, commentaries, abridged retellings. There has been a movie, a couple of TV serials, and you can call the serial a traffic stopper, literally. I don't know how many of us can remember when in the late 80s, the serial was being aired. The roads around India would become empty because everybody would be watching this on television and would fill up later in the day. And the epic describes the rivalry between the Kuru cousins, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, leading to the Mahabharata war. And the Mahabharata has many powerful characters. It has the Pandavas, the Kauravas, Krishna upholding dharma, and of course the incomparable Draupadi, probably one of the most powerful female characters in literary history. And they are all firmly imprinted in our minds. And amongst these, Bhishma is a towering figure in the epic, and he's respected on all sides and called the Pitamaha. And on this occasion of Bhishma Day, we recall Bhishma's advice to Yudhishthira as he, from the bed of arrows on the battlefield. And in the Mahabharata, it's in the Santi Parva, it is in the Rajadharma Anusasana Parva. And it talks about the passage talks about the administration of a state, the role of a king, all the way down to the activities of its subjects. So even though I call it a passage, I think there is enough material for it to form a small book. It's a text of great simplicity, yet timeless insight. But today's talk is not centered around Bhishma as a great teacher and his teachings, but on the Mahabharata itself as a great source of knowledge. The Mahabharata, as I mentioned earlier, narrates the fortunes of the Kuru dynasty. Of course, it has the glorious Bhagavad Gita with the principles of Dharma inside it, but it also contains many ancillary stories. And a few of those stories are the focus of today's talk. A couple of other remarks I want to go with. First thing is the talk references verses from a few translations of the Mahabharata. There is a translation by Sri Vivek Debroy, by Sri Ramesh Menon, and by Sri Manmathanath Dutt. Sri Dutt's translation is about 125 years old and probably deserves to be a classic just by itself, just given the age of the text. And obviously the translations are very similar, but each translator has his own choice of words, and I have just chosen the ones that fit the presentation flow the best. That's about all. I just wanted to add that Sri Debroy is doing sterling service. He has translated the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and he has set himself the task of translating all the Puranas, a truly monumental task. There is also a translation by Professor Lal, and it is interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it is the only translation that's a verse-by-verse translation. So it's useful to remember that the Mahabharata is a poem and it has many verses. It is in verse form, but all the translations that we are familiar with are in prose. Professor Lal has translated this in a verse-by-verse form and tried to keep the original structure of the text. And the other interesting thing is that, in his own words, he calls it a rag bag of verses from all editions. Now, we know that there are many editions of the Mahabharata. There is a northern edition, a Pune edition, a southern edition, and so on. And what Professor Lal has done is, as a lover of Mahabharata, he has collected all the verses from all the editions, put them together, and published a translation. For him, no verse is any less important than the other. So really fascinating amount of work that he has done. And finally, I want to say that this is a slide-based talk. I'll switch to slides for a couple of reasons. First thing is there is some science, quite surprisingly, for a talk about the Mahabharata. And while it is simple, it is best communicated through visuals, right? And the other thing, as you will see in a short while, is that it helps with the citation of verses, right? We'll cite a lot of verses from the various texts, and it'll be helpful as we go forward. So with that, I'll switch to the slide section of today's talk, and I'll begin with some commonly held perceptions of the epic. Okay. So I wanted to start with some widely held perception of the Mahabharata, right? And what can be more widely used than the Wikipedia itself. And here is a quote from the Wikipedia. It starts by saying, the Mahabharata is one of the two major Sanskrit epics of ancient India. It narrates the struggle between two groups of cousins in the Kurukshetra war and the fate of the Kauravas and the Pandavas and their successors. And then it goes on to say it contains philosophical and devotional material such as discussion of the four goals of life or Purushartha. So, and the description, Wikipedia is often described as a very Western view of the world. But I mean, if you asked a lot of people, they might say the same thing. In fact, if you go to a lot of Amazon book pages of translations of the Mahabharata, you see some very similar descriptions of the Mahabharata. You can go onto some government websites and so on, and you will see probably the same thing. Let's see what Maharishi Vyasa himself says about the Mahabharata. And we look at a verse from the Bhagavata Purana. Before I go into the verse itself, I just want to orientate you with how I present the verses. So first you will have the source of the verse, then you'll have the book, the chapter, the section or whatever there is. And then you'll have the translation, the translator. And Board of Scholars is the government of India in the late 50s put together a team of people, what they called a Board of Scholars, to translate the entire Purana Samhita. And they wanted to translate it into English and make it available to the rest of the world. And so it's a very high quality translation in English, and some of the works were later adopted by UNESCO in their World Literary Series. So pretty high quality. And the translation, again, it'll have the verse will have the verse number. So again, it's easy for people to go and check and study more. And especially for the Purana translation, there are many things in parentheses, like you see here. And I want to emphasize that I have not added, these parentheses are put in by the translators themselves. I have not added any material, any words of my own into the translation. I have highlighted a few words for the purpose of the presentation. And in some cases, I have removed a few words just to make the presentation tighter and shorter so that it fits into the allotted slot, right? So almost all the verses are verbatim as they appear in the translations. So let's go to the verse itself. It says, and verily the meaning of the Vedas has been explained by compiling a work of the title Bharata, in which subjects such as religion and others are known by underprivileged persons. So so the Vedas are widely available, but everybody does not have access to them. And even those that have access may not be able to study it and understand the Vedas. They are obviously works of great depth. And so what he's saying is that, that the Mahabharata has been put together to communicate the meaning of Vedas. And it says Vedas, religion, and others. Now, we know that there are a lot of religious instruction in the Vedas, mantras, and so on and so forth. But the Vedas also have passages about the sun, the moon, and the origin of the universe, right? So, the Nasadiya Sukta, which talks about the origin actually of the universe. And so it's very interesting that this verse talks about the Vedas, religion, and others, but doesn't talk anything about the Kurukshetra war. It's quite interesting. But anyway, this is just one verse. Let's look at a couple of others. This is from Professor Lal's translation, and in this is right at the beginning in the Adi Parva. It's one of the first few verses in the translation. And here Vyasa is addressing Brahma. He's standing in front of Brahma, and he's telling Brahma that he has imagined this wonderful poem, and he would like somebody to help him write it down. And this is how he describes the poem to Brahma. He says, the mystery of the Vedas and other mysteries I have explained. I have collected the Puranas and composed their history. Then he says the essence of the Puranas, an account of yoga, the rules for the religious novice, dimensions of the earth, sun and moon, and of planets, stars and constellations, Nyaya, the science of human orthoepy, pathology, charity, Pasupada, and on and on. And there is no mention of the war. In fact, somebody reading this passage might actually think that this passage describes, and when you compare it with what's in the Wikipedia, they might actually think these are two completely different texts that they are referring to, right? And which is not the case. This is actually talking about the Mahabharata and in Maharishi Vyasa's own words. But if you look at this passage and you look at the previous verse from the Bhagavata Purana together, what it suggests is that Maharishi Vyasa wanted to take the core of this story, which is the narration of the war, of the rivalry between the Pandavas and the Kauravas and the war that happened, and wrap around it a complete compendium of knowledge which contains all these things. Now, the challenge that happened is that the war and the characters are so beautifully presented in the Mahabharata that it leaves very little room for the imagination of anything else, basically. So we haven't spent time on any of these other things that the Mahabharata talks about, and that's what we'll get to, right? And so I have underlined a few things here. I have underlined Vedas, and we see that the Vedas keeps coming up. It came up in the previous verse from the Bhagavata Purana. It comes here, and we'll return to it at the end of the presentation. It talks about the essence of the Puranas, right? So it's condensed the Puranas, and it talks about the sun. And this brings me to the structure of this talk. So like I said, we'll explore ancillary narratives from the Mahabharata, and there are 5 stories or passages, and they relate to the sun. They don't talk about the war or the Kauravas or the Pandavas. And these stories are bookended by excerpts from modern science in the Puranas, right? So every story or passage is rendered in 3 parts. It begins with the science for context, so science at a very basic level, not a lot of detail. Then you have the story from the Mahabharata, and then you have the Puranas that provide all the details. Remember, the Mahabharata is the essence of the Puranas, so it has the Puranas in the condensed form, right? So these are the 3 parts for each of the stories, and because we're going to talk about the sun, we'll begin with a very brief look at the science of the sun. So a very brief introduction to the sun. The sun is the giver of life for our planet. Not just our planet, it is the host star of our solar system. So virtually all the energy in our entire solar system comes from the sun. There is virtually no energy that anybody else produces. And because the earth has an atmosphere and it has water, it drives wind and rain on our planet. Over 90% of the sun is hydrogen and most of the rest is helium. And the sun is very hard to study because it's very bright and it generates a lot of heat. But the sun is one of the billions of low-mass stars in the universe. And scientists can make predictions about the sun by studying other similar stars, which are far away, and by using classification and other means, right? So we know a lot of the sun, not by studying the sun itself, but by studying thousands of other stars. A very brief look at the sun. It has 2 significant layers, at least for the purpose of today's presentation. There is a core where fusion occurs. It's a region of very high temperature and pressure, and hydrogen is converted to helium here to release energy. And then you have a shell where the energy is transferred outwards, right? It's transferred through convection and radiation. And there are other outer layers like photosphere, chromosphere, and corona, which are not of interest to today's talk, right? So let's move on. So like I said, the sun is just one of the billions of low-mass stars in the universe. And so the life cycle of the sun of such a star basically has 5 stages. It has the stage of a birth, right? So all stars are born. It has, interestingly, a stage of a young star, right? Hard to believe, but we'll look at that. It is the current mature stage, that the sun that we see in the skies today. It has the stage of a red giant, and we'll come to this, and a white dwarf. And the current stage is estimated to last for another 7 billion years before it transitions to white dwarf and so on and so forth. So let's begin with the first stage, the birth of a star. Okay. So the most widely accepted model for star formation is called the nebula hypothesis. It's a pretty old hypothesis. It's about actually a couple of 100 years old already. And it states that the stars form in giant clouds of hydrogen in space. And these are called giant molecular clouds. And they are named after the constellation that they are located in. So on the right, you see a visual of the Orion molecular cloud. And you can see the 3 stars of the belt of Orion here. And in the nakshatra system, this is the constellation Makara, right? Which is the month of Makara here, quite interestingly. And these giant clouds are hundreds of light years across. So just to put that in context, the distance between the Earth and the Sun is 8 light minutes. And so you can imagine this being hundreds of light years across, so really giant clouds. And these giant molecular clouds can stay unchanged for very long periods of time. But for some reason, some perturbation causes star formation in a particular region, right? And what happens is that this entire cloud of gas and hydrogen, at one place, it starts to collapse in on itself. So the molecules start getting attracted to each other, and they start collapsing to form a ball of gas, right? So it's just a tighter ball of gas from this larger cloud of gas that you have here. And at this stage, it's a protostar. It emits neither heat nor light. And it's, like I said, just a ball of gas. Yeah. So let's see what the Mahabharata says about the birth of the sun god. And the sun, one of the names of the sun god is Martanda, and this passage is from the Harivamsa Parva. Now the Harivamsa Parva, just a little background, it is not one of the 18 Parvas of the Mahabharata. It is, if I may use the phrase, a 19th Parva. It sits alongside the entire Mahabharata and is read as an addendum to the Mahabharata and fills in a lot of details to the narrative, right? So this is from the Harivamsa Parva. And it's a very brief discussion. Here's what it says. Vaishampayana said, O subduer of foes, Kasyapa begat Vivaswan on Aditi, the daughter of Daksha. Kasyapa affectionately said to Aditi, who was ignorant, your embryo is not dead. And so he's called Martanda. So the translation is by Manmatanath Dutt. So just a couple of verses, right? It's not very easy to understand what to make of it. Let's go on. And so we have a little more detail about this in the Brahmanda Purana. So I'm going to cite verses from the Brahmanda Purana. And this is what it says. It says, in the beginning, the Holy Lord created an egg within her belly. The powerful fetus was within the egg. So when it says within her belly, it is the belly of Aditi, right? The wife of Kasyapa. And then goes on to say, when it was taken out of the belly, it resembled a dead lump. Since he was born dead, Mrita, and there is an egg, Anda, Savitra the son is called Martanda by the learned men, right? It's, like I said, book 2, section 3, chapter 7, translated by the Bird of Scholars. So if you look at a summary of what the texts say about the sun, they say it's Anda, a spherical ball of gas. They say it's Mrita, meaning it's dead or inert, and it's very similar to the description of a protostar. So maybe just a coincidence, maybe, yeah. So let's move on. Let's go to the next stage of a star, the young star, and its transition to the mature stage. Yeah. So this is a relatively brief stage. The young star, the stage of youth of a star is a relatively brief stage. It's about 10 million years. Now, 10 million years can seem long, but the life of a star is 10 billion years. So it's 1/10 of 1% of a star's life, right? But it is very significant. It's a very significant stage, and it can be seen, noticed very easily, right? And so what happens is that the proto ball of gas that we talked about earlier, it continues to collapse, and it is driven by its own gravity. And as the molecules of hydrogen get closer to each other, they first start to emit heat, and then after a period of time, they emit light, And at this stage, it's called a young stellar object, or a YSO. And it still has a lot of gas and dust around it, right? Because remember, it's formed from an original cloud of gas and dust. And these are called T Tauri stars because the first such star was discovered in the constellation Taurus. And this is a juvenile star, so it's a very young star, and it's an extremely active stage in the life of a star, right? And the young star is a large ball of gas. It's extremely bright and extremely active, right? And it is characterized by flares which are 1,000 times larger than the solar flares. So now we know that we have flares coming out from the sun, and when they are really large, they can impact communications on the planet, power lines on the planet, and so on. But imagine something 1,000 times larger, and this is a visual of such a star. So there's a pair of binary stars, T Tauri north and south, and the gas that comes out of this star, it goes out in a long stream of gas, which is larger than the star itself. So that's how huge it is. And so it makes the star, which is supposed to be round, it makes it look very misshapen, right? And so this is that stage of the star. And then obviously the star continues to reduce in size. It continues to collapse because of gravity. And the core temperature and pressure continues to increase. And at some point in time, when the temperature and pressure become very high, nuclear fusion is initiated in the core, and hydrogen fuses to form helium. And at this stage, the sun becomes stable. So what's happening is that the heat that is produced in the core of the sun causes the ball of gas to increase in size, whereas the gravitational force causes it to decrease in size, right? And so the two forces become in some form of equilibrium, and the flares are also much reduced now, right? So the current sun that you see, the mature sun that you see in the sky, it is smaller, it is less bright, and it is more spherical than the juvenile sun, the young sun that we saw as a T Tauri star. Let's see what the Mahabharata says about it. The Mahabharata has a story called Samjana, about the marriage of Samjana and Vivaswat. Again, it's from the Harivamsa Parva, and it talks about the transformation of the sun. And again, it starts in a similar way. It says, Vaisampana said, O scorcher of enemies, Vivaswat was born through Kasyapa and Daksha's daughter. Daksha's daughter is Aditi. And Vivaswat's wife was the goddess Samjana, and the daughter of Twashtri. And Twashtri is also known as Viswakarman, which is the god of all immobile beings. And the verse goes on to this: the sun god Martanda blazed in his own energy. This burnt her body, and she did not wish to approach near. Right. So the sun god is seen as very hot, and Samjana doesn't want to go near the sun god because he's really blazing hot and full of a lot of energy. And then this is a fairly long passage, so I'm not going to share all the verses, but let me just paraphrase it for you. So Samjana gets a little upset. She's like, okay, I'm married now to the sun, but I can't approach him. I can't be near him. And after some while, she gets disappointed. And what she does is she is a person of great powers. So she creates an image of herself called Chaya or Sure or Savarna. And she asked that person to stay in her place next to the sun. And she returns to her father's house. And when she goes back to her father's house, Twashtri or Viswakarman receives her warmly, but after a while, he tells her that you must leave because it's not good dharma to stay in your father's house after your marriage. Now, Samjana is upset. She doesn't feel that she's able to go back to Vivaswan. So she decides to pray. And she goes to the forest to perform penance. And she performs penance to say that my husband, who's very active and very bright and very hot, should become more mellow so that I can live with him happily, right? And so she goes off to perform this penance. Now Vivaswan, after a while, after some time, realizes that Chaya, who he's living with, is not his real wife. And so he obviously gets very upset, and he rushes to Vishwakarman's house and asks about his wife. And Vishwakarman or Twashtri says, well, she came here and I asked her to return to work things out with you. But she's very unhappy because you are so energetic and so full of energy and so hot that she cannot stay with you. And so she's praying in the forest for the gods to help her. And this is how it goes. And then Vishwakarman tells the sun, he says, "O scorcher of enemies, if it appeals to you, it is my view that I should now reduce your form and make it handsome. O descendant of Bharata, Twashtra approached Martanda Bivaswan, raised him on a wheel and began to slice off his energy. When his energy was sliced away, his form became resplendent. He became more and more handsome and seemed to be even more beautiful." So this is a translation by Deb Roy. And it's hard to see what to make of this translation, but you can see that the sun was transformed in this process. So let's see what the description in the Puranas says, right? And we can find this both in the Brahmanda and the Markandeya Purana. There seems to be the description. Oh my God, very strong echo. Can somebody mute their line? Okay. So the description in the Brahmanda Purana is similar in length. It's about 35 verses long, as in the Mahabharata, and it includes the birth of Sani and Yama and Yamuna. It has a few additional details, and the story also appears a few times in Markandeya Purana with its own set of details. So let's start with the verses in the Brahmanda Purana. So you have the same set of the same story in the Brahmanda Purana about Samjana marrying Vivaswan and then going back to her house and then performing penance. But the story in the Brahmanda Purana starts out like this. It says, originally the form of Vivaswan was so refulgent that the rays spread sidewards and upward, as well as upwards and downwards. The gentle lady Samjana was afflicted by the form of the Lord of Firmament, i.e. the sun. And then it goes, so the words very clearly says the rays spread sidewards, upwards and downwards, describing the state of the sun when he was newly married, right? The juvenile son. And then the verses in the Brahmanda Purana describe the entire story. And then it comes to the point where Twashtra modifies the sun. And this is how it goes. It says, thereupon Twashtra undertook to change the form of Martanda Vivaswan. He placed him on a circular moving wheel, i.e. a lathe, and pruned the slices of the irregular superfluous part of his brilliance. When his refulgence was taken away, the sun had his brilliance uprooted, i.e. reduced. Right? And then there's a little more detail in the Markandeya Purana, and it says, there's a verse that says, thence onward, the divine sun was only a 16th portion of his refulgence. And so the Markandeya Purana says, after the reduction of the sun by Twashtra or Vishwakarman, only 1/16 of the sun remained. So, you can say that the radius of the sun came down by about 40%. So quite significant reduction in the size of the sun. So when you look at the summary from the texts, what it says is that the unmarried or the juvenile sun is extremely bright and extremely active and misshapen and becomes mature after marriage, like hopefully most young men do. And here Twashtra modifies the sun in 3 ways. The sun is reduced in size, it is made less bright, and it is made more circular in its form, and so more pleasing to look at. And this is close to what is suggested by modern science. So modern science also says that when the sun moves from its T-Tauri stage to the current mature stage, these are the exact three changes that take place in it. It gets reduced in size, it becomes less bright, and it becomes more spherical. So quite a coincidence there. A little more details in the Markandeya Purana, which I thought was really interesting. It says the divine architect, and so the divine architect is Viswakarman. He made with those 15 divisions of his effulgence that had been exhausted, the trident of Shiva, the discus of Vishnu, the dreadful maces of Vasus and Sankara, and the fire god, and the conveyance of the god of riches and other shining weapons of Yakshas, Vidyadharas, and other celestials. So of the 15, so when the sun is reduced to 1/16 of its original size, the 15 portions of it are kind of thrown away literally, and they are used to form. It says Vishwakarman formed Shiva's Trishul, and the discus of Vishnu is, of course, his Vishnu Chakra. The god of riches is Kubera, and his conveyance is his Palki or his Vimana, and the other shining weapons of the Yakshas and the Vidyadharas. And I leave it to your imagination to figure out what exactly is being suggested here. The origin of the sun is also mentioned in the Varaha Purana, right? So again, in the Varaha Purana, it says that the sun initially was extremely bright and extremely active. And but then it does not have the story of Samsana and Vivaswan. Basically, the Varaha Purana says that the sun is prayed to by the Devas. And when the Devas pray to the sun becomes less bright. So the prayer starts like this. It says, "You are the firstborn in the world." It's from the Varaha Purana, chapter 26 and verse 10 says, "You are the firstborn in the world, you protect the world and also destroy it at the time of deluge. When you rise, you enliven the whole universe, we always bow to you." And so this is the first verse. There are 3 or 4 other verses. That's like a small prayer to the sun. And I have highlighted destroyed at the time of deluge because I wanted to, because this is not something that we associate with the sun, but we'll come back to this thought at the end of the presentation. And then it says, "When thus extolled by the Devas, the sun assumed a gentle form and shed luster on them. The fierceness became reduced for the Devas, and it was in the Tithi Saptami that the sun became embodied." So basically it says the sun became less bright. So it says it assumed a gentle form. The fierceness became reduced. And it says it was in the Tithi Saptami. Now, obviously, science does not have a date for this or something, but in our Puranas, it says that it happened, it is associated with the Tithi Saptami. And when you go to the Skanda Purana, it talks about it in a little more detail. It says, the Radha Saptami falls on the 7th lunar day of Magha, when for the first time in the beginning of the Manvantara, the sun got into his chariot. And so, when the sun got into his chariot is when the sun became the sun that we see in the skies today, right? And the Radha Saptami, and it's on the day of Radha Saptami. Now, the Radha Saptami, this is the month of Magha. In Tamil Nadu, we call it the month of Thai. And we are in Panchami today on Basant Panchami. 3 days from now is Bhishma Ashtami, right? For the reason for which that the Bhishma Day was probably organized. And the day before Bhishma Ashtami is Radha Saptami. The Saptami is called Radha Saptami. And that is the day when the sun became the mature sun that we see in the skies today. And the Radha Saptami is celebrated in temples, in major temples in the south of India. In the north of India, where the sun worship is more common, people celebrate it in their houses itself, or they go to the Ganga and take a dip. And so it's more widespread in the north, and it's called Surya Jayanti there. But if you stand back and look at it, you can trace a line. You can trace a straight line from an annual festival that is celebrated by ordinary people all over India, all the way through the verses in the Puranas, the verses in the Mahabharata, to the science of the sun. So you can draw a direct line from the activity of the ordinary people, a festival that is celebrated by ordinary people directly to the signs of the sun. And that is quite amazing. I thought that was quite fascinating. So we move on to the current mature stage of the sun. The sun is described in the text in a fair amount of detail, right? And it talks about the distance of the sun and so on and so forth. But I just want to focus on just one aspect of the sun for today's discussion, today's talk. So like we said earlier, the sun provides rain, sun provides warmth, and it creates wind and rain. And the water rises from the oceans, it forms clouds that blow onto land and form rain, right? And when it rains, the water flows into rivers, and then the rivers empty out into oceans. And this is our water cycle. But interestingly, the water cycle was not known until very recently. And it was first proposed by a French engineer called Bernard Palissy in the late 16th century. And it was only in the early 19th century that it was accepted by modern science. And let's see what the Mahabharata text, which is probably more than 1,000 years older than this, says about the rain and the sun. So the verses are from the Santi Parva. It's a conversation between Vyasa and Suka. They are performing some rituals, and here's what it says. It's a very brief passage. It says, there is a wind that sucks up water from the four oceans. Having sucked it up, this wind gives it to the clouds in the sky. Having given it to the clouds, it gives it to Parjanya. This is the third wind which always blows and gives rise to rain and has the name Udvaha. And this is a translation by Debroy. So it talks about the clouds that the wind sucks up the water from the oceans, forms the clouds, and then the clouds blow over and gives rain, right? So on. The Brahmanda Purana has a more detailed description, and it says, in combination with the wind, the rays of the sun carry the waters from the ocean, and that water becomes the nectar-like life giver unto the plants. Then as the season approaches at the proper time, the sun changes the saltish water into sweet water and gives water to the clouds, and the water station falls down when they are wafted by the wind. Accompanied by the wind, they are spread everywhere for the welfare of all living beings. And so this describes the formation of clouds and the falling of rain. But here is where it gets interesting. It says the water is continuously thrown up, turned into vapor, and dropped down, and there is no total destruction of water. The same water gets transformed. And this is the first, and this very clearly talks about the cyclicality of the process. So there is no loss of water or gain of water. So the water keeps moving around in the cycle. It goes up as vapor, becomes clouds, and then gets dropped down as rain. So quite significant. And then there is another verse. It says much later on in the same chapter, it says, smoke is conducive to the development of all of them. All of them is all, the chapter this passage describes the various kinds of clouds in the Puranas, and it says it is conducive to the development of all of them without distinction. So smoke, as we know, is basically what rises from a fire. It's basically hot air and dust that rise from the top of a fire and go up into the upper layers of the atmosphere. Now, we know that you can have water vapor in the atmosphere, but they will not form clouds unless there are particles of dust that they can condense around. And the particles of dust generally come from smoke, and it can be it can be smoke that may be from a forest fire or from any other form of fire. And so this is a remarkable insight that is presented in the Puranas, which is an older text, admittedly, but a text around the same age as the Mahabharata. And it also points to why yagyas are seen as very important in the Vedic Vedic religion, saying that it is important. The performance of yagyas are important to the creation of smoke, and smoke gives rise to clouds and then rain. So if you look at the summary, the text describes the water cycle. It describes the evaporation, formation of clouds, precipitation, and the water draining back into the ocean, and that the water is indestructible, right? And this is very close to what is suggested by modern science. Let's talk about the last two stages of the life of the sun, and we'll start with the red giant stage, right? So after about 7 billion years, the hydrogen in the core is exhausted. So what happens is that all the hydrogen nuclei, they fuse to form helium, and there is no more hydrogen left in the core, essentially, right? And this is estimated to happen in about 7 billion years. All of it is converted to helium. And at this stage, the sun can produce energy in two ways. So the helium in the core is now full of helium because all the hydrogen is converted to helium. And this helium nuclei in the core can now fuse to form carbon nuclei, right? And the hydrogen in the shell, you still have hydrogen, and these hydrogen nuclei in the shell can fuse to form helium. Right? And as a result, the sun grows enormously in size. And examples of the red giant sun are the star Rohini or Aldebaran. Right? And so the star Rohini or Aldebaran is just 16% larger, has more mass than the sun. So it's not much, it does not much more massive than the sun. It's 40 times bigger than the sun and 400 times brighter, right? And so this is very hard for us to imagine. So I put a visual on the side for you to get, for us to understand this well. This is the existing sun, and you have the planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and so on. And it is not drawn to scale. Just it's a schematic diagram, but you can see all the planets here. And when the sun becomes old, when it's like 7 billion years older than it is now, it is a red giant. And this sun actually swallows up the planets of Mercury and Venus. So you have the sun, and right next to it, you have the Earth, and you have Mars, and so on and so forth. So the near planets just get swallowed up by the sun, and they probably vaporize, right? Because by the heat of the sun. That's it's kind of hard to imagine, but that's how it is. And this is not just imaginary. There's a lot of papers that have been written on the sun. So in 1987, there was a paper written by, scientific paper written by J. Goldstein. And at that time, he suggested that the red giant sun would actually engulf the Earth as well. So not just the planets of Mercury and Venus, but also the planet Earth. In 1993, there was a paper by Juliana Sackman and others which said that the sun's gravity would decrease over time. So we have all these solar flares we talk about, and each solar flare is actually a huge ejection of mass of gas just going out into space. And when this gas gets ejected into space over billions of years, the mass of the sun decreases. And as the mass of the sun decreases, the gravitational attraction on the various planets decreases, and the planets move into larger and larger orbits as a result of this. And even though they suggested that even though the sun becomes very big, the Earth would be in a larger orbit, and so it would escape the red giant sun. And then in 2008, there was another paper that said that the sun also exerts what's called a force of tidal attraction on the Earth. And I'm not going into detail here, but it basically says because of this, the sun will not be able to move out far enough. And the paper suggested that at its maximum, when the red giant sun was at its maximum, the sun would just get absorbed, the Earth would just get enveloped by it. It would just engulf the Earth. And they go on to say that if the Earth had been a little further away, like about 15% further away today, the Earth might have escaped the red giant sun. And this is an artist's impression. All of this is very hard to imagine, right? So I've taken this from Wikipedia. This is an artist's impression of the Earth close to a red giant sun. So this is what happens when when the sun gets very close to the Earth. You can see the Earth is completely black. It's burnt, right? So this is the burnt Earth. There is no possibility of life on the planet. There is no water, obviously. There's no ice caps, nothing. And all you can see is big blotches of red. And these blotches of red are basically either rocks that are on fire, right? Rocks that are molten and are on fire, or places where the Earth's crust has cracked and the mantle of the Earth is coming out as lava. And so you have oceans of lava on the surface of the Earth, giant pools of lava on the surface of the Earth. And so it's a very terrifying description of the Earth. And fortunately, we have an artist who, that has actually put together this view of the Earth and the sun so that we can imagine this. Let's see what the Mahabharata says about this, right? And this is from the Banana Parva, and this is when the Pandavas are in exile. They are in the Kamyaka Vana, and they are visited by Rishi Markandeya and by Krishna at the ashrama. And Rishi Markandeya is a Chiranjeevi. He is supposed to have lived through Kalpa, through the end of, through periods such as this. And so Yudhishthira asks the Rishi what the end of a Kalpa looks like. And this is what he says. He says, towards the end of the thousands of years that make up the 4 yugas, when the lives of men become short and a drought comes that lasts for many years, men and creatures of little strength and vitality die of hunger in their millions. And the Lord of men, and then, Lord of men, 7 blazing suns appear in the sky and suck up all the waters of the earth from the rivers and seas. All things made of wood or grass, wet and dry, are reduced to ashes. And this translation is by Menon. And it goes on to say, fanned by high winds, there is a fire called the Samvartaka that flares upon the earth already dried up by the 7 suns. In a flash, the fire destroys everything upon and below the earth's surface. Samvartaka, fanned by ill winds, consumes this world and all the hundreds and thousands of yojanas, right? So now that we have the context, the scientific context, we can have an idea. These are very few verses, but we can have an idea of what is being suggested here. Let's see what the Puranas say about it. So the Brahmanda and the Vayu Purana have very good descriptions of this event, and there's a slightly shorter description available in the Kurma Purana. So the Puranas have much more detail around this. The passage is around 25 verses, and it's like condensed to about 8 verses in the Mahabharata, right? So it's much shorter in the Mahabharata. And the thing to remember is that it's a simple description, right? There is no gods or kings or wives or queens or something, nothing to interpret. It is just how a simple science text would describe this. But once we know the context, you will see that it's chilling in its accuracy. And I've mentioned 3 Puranas here, but the Kalpa and sun burning the earth is widely mentioned in the Purana. There are multiple mentions in many Puranas. So I think that's the way we need to understand this. It's not limited to a few Puranas. And so I'm going to start at the Brahmanda Purana. And like I said, this is called the Samvartaka Aditya. Samvartaka Aditya is a combination of 2 words. Samvartaka means destruction, annihilation, and Aditya is a name for the sun. So it's the sun that annihilates the universe. And the verses are from a chapter titled The Dissolution of the Universe, right? That's the name of the chapter in the Brahmanda Purana. And this is what it says. It says, at the end of 1,000 sets of Chaturyugas, when a period of annihilation of the yugas arrives, the Prajapati, i.e. Brahma, begins to make the subjects abide in him. Then a continued drought lasting for 100 years takes place. Living beings deficient in strength become dissolved and get mingled with the dust. The 7 rays of the sun that blaze in the sky, sucking up water, drink water from the great ocean. Being burned by their brilliant flames, the earth, including mountains, rivers, and oceans, becomes bereft of moisture and viscidity. Then it goes on to say, being restrained by the rays of the sun that burn brightly, the earth is enveloped entirely beneath, above, and all sides. And then it goes on to say, getting the fiery splendor transmitted to it, the entire universe slowly assumes the form of a huge block of iron and shines thus. So basically the imagery that's given in the last verse is that if you leave a block of iron in a fire for a long period of time, it begins to glow. And that is, and so basically it says that the earth inside the sun starts to glow given all the heat that is being transferred to it. And so if you look at what the texts say, if you summarize, the timeline is similar to the sun's life. It's in billions of years. It's what happens at the end of a kalpa. So you saw in the previous verse, it talks about 1,000 sets of Chaturyugas. 1,000 set of Chaturyugas is one kalpa, which is 4.32 billion years. So the timeline is similar to the sun's life, which is in billions of years. So when the sun just starts to increase in size, right? Let's say it's a little larger than it is right now. The temperature of the earth becomes a little hotter. Let's say it becomes 10, 20 degrees or maybe 30, 40 degrees hotter. And when that happens, there is a drought. So it's impossible for it to have rain. And the drought starts killing the plants and animals. So initially there is just a drought. It kills the plants and animals. And as as the sun grows bigger and the earth gets hotter, the heat of the sun begins to dry up the oceans. It dries up the oceans and the rivers. And then finally, when the sun becomes so big that it envelops the earth begins to glow. And like I said, it's a simple description. There is no story. And this is exactly what we talked about, when we discussed the science. And so the description that you see in the Puranas is very similar to what is suggested by modern science. So let's move on to the next stage of the sun, the white dwarf stage. And the white dwarf stage represents the collapse of the sun. And so what happens is we saw that in the core of the sun, we saw the hydrogen forming helium, then we saw the helium forming hydrogen. And whenever all the helium has become hydrogen, which in the red giant stage lasts for about 1.5 to 2 billion years, then the carbon atoms fuse together to form oxygen and they become even larger. And this keeps on going and they form larger atoms till they form iron. And the atoms of iron can't fuse because when they fuse, they don't release any energy. And so you need a chain reaction. You need atoms fusing with each other, releasing energy, which creates a chain reaction, which causes the other nuclei to fuse. But when you reach iron, there is no more energy that can be released. And so the process becomes subtractive. And so the entire chain reaction just stops, right? And so the atoms no longer fuse. There is no more energy. And if you recall what we said in the beginning, it is the heat that is generated in the core of the sun that keeps it as a big ball of gas, right? So that heat generated in the core keeps it in balance against the gravitational force that is causing the sun to collapse in on itself. But when the heat stops, the core of the sun just begins to collapse. This happens very quickly. And the core collapses to form what is called a white dwarf star. And it's very small and extremely dense. And the material in the shell is thrown out to produce beautiful, what is called planetary nebulae, right? The phrase is very old and kind of is misplaced, but that's what it's called. And basically what you see here is you see a huge cloud of gas that is being thrown out. And the cloud of gas, this is the material in the shell, which gets thrown out as a cloud. And the material in the shell has different atoms. It may have helium, carbon, oxygen, iron. It may have different kinds of atoms. And these atoms interact with the radiation that's produced by the core, and they glow beautifully to form these beautiful planetary nebulae. And the core of the sun is just a small dot in the center. It's just this white dwarf that is in the center of the whole thing. So it becomes extremely small. And so it's basically incredible. The white dwarf is incredibly small. It's half the sun's mass and the size of the earth, right? And because it is so small, it is very far away from the earth now. So you can imagine the red giant sun was huge and it almost engulfed the sun. Now, when the sun collapses in size, the whole thing becomes very far away. And the sun is now emitting light, but it is emitting light from stored energy. It's not producing any heat anymore. And as a result, the earth starts to cool rapidly, right? Because the entire process of collapse is actually quite rapid, and the cooling of the earth is also quite rapid. And the atmospheric water vapor begins to condense, and it creates huge clouds and continuous rain. So this entire phenomenon is very difficult for us to understand. So let me kind of explain it in a little more detail. So when we talk about the atmospheric water vapor, it is the entire water on the surface of the earth. So it is the water in lakes, ponds, wells, rivers, oceans. It is the water in the tops of snow caps of mountains, glaciers. It is in the pole. It is the ice in the poles, the icebergs. All of them melt and evaporate. It is the water in the bodies of plants, animals, and insects. Even that water, everything gets burnt and turned to dust, and all the water evaporates. And the water in the rocks, in the dust, in just about every particle or molecule of water on the surface evaporates, and it hangs in the air as some kind of superheated vapor. And this entire mass of water vapor starts to condense. And you can imagine the clouds that are formed. The clouds that are formed are huge, and they rain continuously, right? And let's see what the Mahabharata says about it. And this is a continuation from the Banana Parva, and it's narrated by Rishi Markandeya to Yudhishthira. And here's what he says. He says, cloud masses like herds of elephants decked with garlands of lightning fill the sky and are wonderful to see. And O king, these clouds are terrifying to behold, and streaked with lightning roar frightfully. These rain-charged masses quickly cover all of the sky and flood the earth and her mountains and forests and mines with water, right? So this translation is by Menon. And then it goes on to say, impelled by the Supreme Lord, the clouds inundate the entire surface of Bhumi with great downpours and douse the raging fire. So remember that the earth is still extremely hot. It's burning literally, right? So the rocks are on fire, and the clouds bring rain without let for 12 years, flooding the earth. And then Bharata, the ocean, breaks his shores, flashing over the continents. The mountains shatter into fragments, and the earth sinks under a deluge. Right? So, once you get the context, it's a pretty terrifying description of what happens to the earth. Right? Let's see what we see in the Puranas. So we talked when we set up to this, we said both the Brahmanda and the Vayu Purana have good descriptions. So I'll take the description of the flooding from this of the Samvartaka clouds from the Vayu Purana. And the chapter is similarly titled The Manvantaras in the Dissolution of the Universe. And the clouds are called the Samvartaka clouds, the clouds of dissolution, of annihilation, basically. And let's see what the verse says. It says, thereafter, the terrible Samvartaka clouds begin to rise in the sky. They assume the shape of herds of huge elephants and are embellished with lightning streaks. Terrific in appearance and multiformed, all the clouds, thundering terribly, fill the entire firmament at that time. The clouds then shower energetically and quell the entire inauspicious and terrible fire. The universe is filled with waters of the heavy downpour. And then it goes on to say, when a couple of 100 years, the whole fire is quelled, the clouds that arise from the fire inundate the entire universe with huge quantities of showers. So it talks about the fact when the rays first fall on the hot, glowing earth, they immediately evaporate and they form clouds again. And these clouds again go up, and then they form rain again and huge showers. And this happens in cycles until it completely cools the earth. And then it says, then the oceans overflow their shores all around, the mountains crumble down, and the earth sinks into the water. In the Ekarnava, the single vast sheet of water, all mobile and immobile beings get dissolved. When 1,000 cycles of 4 yugas pass away, it is called a complete kalpa. And this is from the Vayu Purana. It is the Upasamhara Pada. And the word Upasamhara, it has the word Samhara in it. And Samhara again means destruction. It is the part of the Vayu Purana that describes the destruction of the of the universe. So again, you can see pretty amazing detail that is available. Once you see the context, the detail is quite, context from the scientific perspective, the detail is quite chilling. So if you look at the summary in the text, you can see that the sun's collapse is a dramatic effect. The earth is no longer burned by the sun, it cools quickly. The water vapor forms huge clouds, and the pralaya, the dissolution from the rains, submerges the earth, and the earth becomes one vast ocean. So the word Ekarnava actually is a combination of two words, Eka meaning one and Arnava meaning ocean, right? And the earth is just one vast ocean. And again, this is important to note that this is a description. There is no story to interpret, no kings or queens or sages or gods, nothing, right? It's just how a simple science text would describe this. And it is surprising how detailed the description is. Now, let's look at the submerged earth in science. And this is a very recent development. So there is a paper in March 2020, and it's by two scientists, two geologists called Johnson and Wing from Australia. And for the first time, they suggested that the early Earth was submerged. And this is a news article from the Science Digest, sciencenews.com. And this is actually an artist's impression of the entire planet drowned in water. So the entire planet is one big ocean of water that has been envisaged here, that is kind of represented here. And that is extremely well described in the Puranas here. And a more recent paper, actually just a few months old, talks about the emergence of some of the earliest parts of the Earth's crust from this giant ocean, from this vast ocean. And so this is the current view of the early Earth. Like I said, this is just formed about 1 year ago. And it states this happened about 3 billion years ago. Now, I want to make it very explicit. Up until now, we were talking about the future of the Earth and the future of the sun, whereas this refers to the past, about 3 billion years ago. But it's important to understand that the kalpa is a cycle, and so it's a cyclical process. And so what the Earth submerged in this vast ocean is actually describing is what happened at the end of the previous kalpa. And the Puranas are very explicit. They say it is a naimittika pralaya or pratisarga that happens here. And the same thing will happen again at the end of the current kalpa, at the end of the Varaha kalpa. So it's very consistent in what it talks about. So coming to the end, if you look at it, you can see that the Mahabharata, that the science talks about the life of the sun in 5 steps. It talks about the birth, the young star, the mature star, the red giant, and the white dwarf. And the Mahabharata and the Puranas actually talk about pretty much everything. They talk about the birth as the birth of Martanda, the inert star that emits neither heat nor light. There is the description of a young star, the marriage of Samjana and Vivaswan. The brightness of Vivaswan is extreme, and the rays are extending in all directions, like we see in a T-Tauri star. And then we see the mature star that we see in the skies today. The rays and the size and the brightness are reduced, and we see the story of Surya Jayanti when the sun becomes formed. And we see a description of the water cycle, at least 1,000 years before modern science talked about it. We see the description of the sun as a red giant, the sun as the Samvartaka Aditya. The sun here heats up the earth, envelops the earth, heats it up and makes it glow. And then we see the sun as a white dwarf. The sun collapses, the planet cools, and then we have the Samvartaka clouds that bring torrential rain to the planet and submerge the earth. And this is the same order of magnitude as a kalpa, which is a timeline of 4.32 billion years. So this timeline of the sun, the life of a sun is 10 billion years, and I've written a separate paper how the two compare. But for the purpose of today's talk, we can see that they are the same order of magnitude. So it's quite surprising. And so this is an astonishing level of detail that we find in the Mahabharata and the Puranas that correlates extremely well with modern science. And so we see that the Mahabharata is a compendium of knowledge. It's not just the story of rival cousins. It has a concise description of the life of the sun. The epic also talks about the origin of the moon, of our waters. It talks about other events in the Earth's history, the Earth's geography, the solar system, and much more. And some of these stories have been explored in a book titled From the Beginning of Time. But the epic also covers many other topics that are listed at the start. And which is why the Puranas talk about the Mahabharata as the fifth Veda. And so the Bhagavata Purana, the Vayu Purana, and many other texts talk about the Mahabharata and the Puranas together as the fifth Veda. And that is the amount of knowledge that the Mahabharata contains. And it is thanks to progress in science that these stories are just charming tales. So the text is more than 1,000 years old, and I'm sure people read it before. But if you don't understand the science of the sun, you would never understand what exactly was being referred to here. But it is amazing to see such profound knowledge in a text of this antiquity. And on this Bhishma Day event, we should not only recall Bhishma Pitamaha and his teachings on Rajadharma. I also bow in gratitude to Maharishi Vyasa for giving us this jewel, this incredible treasure of knowledge, the Mahabharata. With that, I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and your attention. And with the permission of the chair, if there are any questions, I don't know if we have time, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you very much, ma'am. Yeah. Dr. Sundaram? Yeah.
Subramaniam,
Yeah,
give the vote of thanks.
I think, am I audible?
Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. In the beginning itself, I would like to offer our sincere gratitude for the wonderful presentation by our learned speaker of the day, Sri Ganesh. And to be very frank, we never expected such an amount of scientific details. Though we have been doing some projects at our research institute on this line. In fact, one lady is working on the properties of the sun for her PhD now. Maybe we will come out with more information on this. And we have one professor, Parthasarathi, geography professor, with whom we have done a wonderful work on the submarine fire called Vadavagni, how our Puranas contain a lot of scientific details and how everything comes closer to the modern science, what have been discussed in the Puranas. And he has also been able to find out a lot of such similarities on the evolution of Earth from the Puranas perspective, as well as from the Puranas, which we will be bringing out shortly in book form. But coming to today's lecture, our learned speaker started telling about, he gave a very brief introduction about Mahabharata. And in fact, without Harivamsa, we will not be having the name Shata Sahasrika for Mahabharata, because in some editions there are 80,000 verses, in some editions there are 94,000 verses, or 80 to 90,000 verses. Right. Only when we add Harivamsa, it comes to 100,000 verses. And therefore, Harivamsa also plays an important role in Mahabharata. He pointed out this so beautifully. And coming to I won't go to all the details of the sun, S-U-N, sun, but there is a beautiful description of this cycle, as Sri Ganesh Ji was trying to explain to us. And even Lord Krishna tells the same in the Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter. He says, Annad Bhavati Bhutani Parjanyat Annasambhavaha, and this is what he said. Yajnat Bhavati Parjanyaha. That is what he mentioned so beautifully. During Vedic time, they performed the sacrifices, and which were the cause of the forming of smoke and dust, forming the Parjanya. So, which he very beautifully pointed out. So, Lord Krishna also says, Yajnat Bhavati Parjanyaha. So, and then Parjanyat. So, like, and the next words Lord Krishna says, Evam Pravartitam Chakram. So, this is a cycle. The very word has been used by Lord Krishna himself. And the point that he stressed was that the water cycle, how it formed, and the modern science was able to discover it maybe 100 years or 150 years ago, which we find strangely very well described in Bhagavad Gita as well as in our Puranas. And one thing we have learned from the Puranas is our learned speaker was talking about the 7 suns sucking up the energy, water, everything from the earth. But according to the Puranas, at the time of deluge, there are going to be 12 Adityas. So Lord Krishna also says, Adityanam Aham Vishnu, the commentators write, there are 12 Adityas and Vishnu is the best among them. So at the time of deluge, at Pralaya, Mahapralaya, there will be 12 suns according to the Puranic view also. And that the earth came out from the sun has also been described in our Puranas, and also the planet, what we call the Kuja. Ku means the earth. So we have got the Mars coming out of the earth, Kuja. So from Ku, that is from the earth, it went off. Therefore, that is also well known to us. And strangely, sir, you have been, explaining the concept of the earth becoming red in color when it comes closer to the sun. So, because of the heat, and in yogic parlance, the earth is also represented in red color. This is just additional information. When we are talking of the chakra system, Mooladhara is associated with the earth and it is of red color. So we also, there is a parallelism between the mysticism as well as the geography as well as our Vedic science in this. And there is a beautiful description which he explained to us about Ekarnava. And even in the Vedas, we say, for example, there are clues in our Veda, so which says the earth came from the water. So, Adhya Sambhodha Prithivya, like that we say, even in Purusha Sutta, Adhya Sambhodha Prithivya. So, the earth coming out of the waters. And there is a clue to it even in Nasadya Sutta, which he referred to, that there is water, unfathomable water. That is what the Nasadya Sutta also describes. And, in our Puranas, the earth has been hidden under the water, and it was Varaha. Lord Vishnu took the form of Varaha and he uplifted the earth. So all this point out to the fact that our ancients, thousands of years before, knew the concept that the earth was once upon a time hidden under the sea, and it took some time to come out, to emerge out of the sea. And what came out, that also our Puranas explain so beautifully. And in science we see that the particles of water, they contain single molecules, singular cell, and then 2, 4 like that. And our Puranas explain so wonderfully that they started magnifying themselves in geometric progression. So, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16 like that it went on. Koti Koti Sahasrasaha. That is what our Purana says, and that formed the earth. So these things have been explained so well, and unfortunately, those who are dealing only with Sanskrit like us, we do not know, we do not have scientific background, and it is an excellent opportunity for us to learn so many things from Sri Ganesh. And I would urge him to make more and more, or probe more and more, like he did today, and bring out more and more fascinating details. And that is what is needed during the present time, to bring out the fact that we too had some scientific background, but these have been explained in different connotations. And I think people like Sri Ganeshji deserve our appreciation. And on behalf of Samskrita Academy, sir, we offer our felicitations. And in fact, we respect you for your excellent and very deep scholarship. And thank you for joining us today and giving us a glimpse of the scientific
you very much.
background in Mahabharata. We do have more such things like Sagara, producing 60,000 children. All these things have been explained so wonderfully. This comes closer to the sign. And I take this opportunity to thank all those who joined today's meeting and the endowment makers, TV Viswanatha Iyer family and Sri K. Chandrasekharan. And they were really connoisseurs. They would have been very happy to listen to your lectures. Maybe from above, they have been listening to your lectures.
I hope so.
And just for the information of those who have been attending this lecture, this will be uploaded in the YouTube, and so this can be shared with more and more people so that all the people, those who have got scientific background as well as from the Sanskrit background, they will get benefited. Once again, I thank Sri Ganesh ji and I request him again to come and visit us at his leisure so that we will all be benefited by your scholarship, sir. Thank you for your excellent exposition on this subject. We look forward to more and more such excellent talks and articles and books from you, sir, for the benefit of all of us. Thanks to all the participants, and I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you.
Thank you, sir. Mrs. Lavanya can close the meeting. Professor